This is Duke University.
Thank you so much, Prasenjit. And
You have to
yeah,
turn on the.
yeah, it's already on. Uh, I would like to thank Duke University and Prasenjit and Jan, uh, who invited me to speak here and interact with you. Uh, the Ganges itself is a long river, and I'm going to speak on the mid-Ganga section. It's the middle part of the Ganga, which I'm going to talk about. And as Prasenjit has already been speaking about the turning points in history, I also have chosen 19th century as a period because that was a major turning uh, point in terms of the history of the Ganges, what is also known as the Ganga. So, the most of the emerging states, early modern states, uh, they have been trying to enhance their revenue systems through the revenue systems, new mechanisms. They enhance the revenue and they try to increase their cultivable area. Now, the Mughals did it, many other early modern states did it in this part of the Gangetic Basin. Uh, but they have never challenged the river system. They have done it through their governors, through their officers. They have not even challenged the cropping patterns that was existing in those areas. Now, the major transformations that we see, that we witness, starts by the end of the 18th century, and 19th century was a a period when many rules were implemented by the British government. Now, before I look at this aspect of the changing rules and acts that were introduced by the British government, let me tell you a little bit about the morphology and the morphology dynamics of the Ganga in this part of India. Uh, as you know that the Ganga itself is traversed by many rivers, and large rivers in fact traverse the Ganga plains, and of them the Ganga itself is the largest, that flows eastward from the northwest, finally descending into the Bay of Bengal. So if you look at this picture here, river Ganga comes from there in the Himalayas, from the Gangotri, and it goes down to the Bay of Bengal. So it's almost a distance of 2,510 kilometers. So it has a huge catchment area, some 980,000 square kilometer. The river originates in the Himalayas and flows in the southeasterly direction. But when it reaches the mid-Ganga section, it flows from west to east. So if you look at the upper Ganga section, it's actually coming from north to south. But when it enters into the mid-Ganga area, here it is actually moving from west to east. The Himalayan range runs almost parallel to the Ganga in this section of the mid-Ganga basin. As a result, many other rivers descending from the Himalayas meet the Ganga. While the Himalayan rivers such as the Gomti, Ghaggar, Gandak, Kosi meet the Ganga from the north, the Betwa, Chambal, Kane and Son rivers that originate in the central Indian Craton feed the Ganga basin from the south. Due to the gradual descent from the Himalayan mountains, the rivers draining the Ganga basin have huge sediment transfers from Himalayas that gets deposited in the Ganga plains. The melting of the glaciers in the higher reaches of the Himalayas in the month of June, July and August, and the monsoon rains during these months wash down the loose soil into the rivers flowing down from here. The rivers often cut a new path in the hugely spread out riverbed of mid-Ganga section through the deposited sediments. So the frequent avulsion of rivers is very common in the area. The province of Bihar is a major portion of the mid-Ganga basin where many rivers meet the Ganga. So all these blue lines which are coming from the Himalayas, these are all meeting the Ganga in these. This is Ganga coming here. So all these rivers coming from the Himalayas are actually meeting the Ganga here. And there are many coming from the Deccan Plateau also. So they all meet the Ganga. So here the flow of the water is more spread out due to the congregation of different rivers from both north and south. The Ganga and other rivers allowed a number of towns and settlements to emerge in the ancient past, such as Patliputra, that is now modern day Patna, Champa, which is modern day Bhagalpur, and Angika, the modern day Munger. Now, all these cities of ancient times grew and flourished even in early modern and modern times. Now, when we talk about the rivers, in early modern times always pose a challenge to the cavalry-based regimes. Now, the Mughals were actually rulers who moved on their horses. So they are known for their cavalry, their powerful cavalry. They are not known for their strong navy. So that's the interesting part. We'll come back to that a little later. In that sense, the thesis of the exposed zones of Victor Lieberman is debatable, especially in the context of the mid-Ganga plain. In fact, Victor Lieberman uses the term exposed zones for the entire Indo-Gangetic zone in contrast to the protected zones of Eurasia. So the protected zones, according to him, were located at a distance from Central Asia, which was sufficient to avoid invasion by the nomads. The Turkic and the Mongol nomads, moving on horses, repeatedly invaded the exposed zones like the Indo-Gangetic. That is why the conquest and the establishment of ruling dynasties from the steppes were more apparent. The fragility and fluidity of the state of India throughout history was also due to the exposed position. I believe that contrary to Lieberman's argument, in the mid-Ganga plain, the geographical barriers like the Ganga and its tributaries limited Turkic and Mongol control. Throughout its history, imperial administration was not so stable in the capital city of Patna and the surrounding regions. In fact, later Bihar Suba was created, but Bihar Suba never remained under the tight control of the Mughals. The ambitious local leaders in Bihar saw even a slight absence of the imperial officials as an opportunity to take control. The available documents suggest that the subversion of the imperial authority was recurrent due to the geography of Bihar, which was interwoven by many rivers. To control Bihar from Agra and Delhi, to control Bihar from Agra and Delhi was difficult, even though the Mughal emperors were able to control the rebellion with huge force. The victories were only temporary. Once the army withdrew, the local chiefs often resurfaced to defy the revenue collection of the Mughals. So they would often, whenever there were, the Mughal officers coming with the army and the force, they will just go into the river, take the boat, and go to the other side. So it was very difficult to control that area. This could perhaps partly explain why the Dutch and the English East India companies were later able to acquire trading rights in Bihar from the Mughals so easily. So it was one of the earliest regions where the revenue collection rights were handed over to the British in 1765. Now the early modern, so you can see all these East India Company ships going in the Ganges. The early modern history of conflict in the region indicates that its river ecology was unique and needed a distinct navy that was in sync with the local environment. Only those who handled navigability of the rivers of Bihar were successful. Before the British, the Dutch East India Company used the Ganga for the commercial activities in Bihar, and later the East India Company used the downstream flow of the river to export the bulk of grains and saltpeter to the port of Calcutta on the east coast, from where they were shipped to Europe. The river navigability of the region also helped the British East India Company to get a firmer hold over the region. For the collection of the revenue from the remote villages, it introduced the permanent settlement and signed an agreement with the zamindars, or the landlords. The landlords were asked to pay fixed revenue to the government, and in return, they were recognized as hereditary proprietors of the land. The East India Company, despite its long presence in Bihar and reliance on river communication, could not fully comprehend the river ecology and the traditional knowledge of irrigation when it came to actually administering the territory. In contrast, the early modern states in India were able to sustain themselves by extracting land revenue from the cultivators without interfering in the traditional methods. During the 19th century, the colonial government came up with various regulations to broaden its revenue base that was not in sync with the local ecology. It went on to pass various acts like Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation Act, the Canal Act, the Bengal Embankment Act, the Bengal Tenancy Act in the 19th century. Now, if we look at the region, climatically, the region lies in the crossroads of a wet eastern coastal regions and the relatively dry continental region of the western plains. This sometimes leads to monsoon variability, leading to drought. Since agriculture in the mid-Ganga plain is largely dependent on the monsoon rains and the overflowing river system, every once in a while, the failure of rains followed by massive inundation of rivers would take place between June and August in Bihar. And this would not lead to complete crop failures in the past. The cultivators, rather than perceiving inundation as flood, actually believed in flood utilization, and dependence on it for agricultural production was very common. They evolved a cropping pattern that was in tune with the annual occurrence of flood. Traditional irrigation methods were used and they were evolved to face such challenges. Flush irrigation was one of the most common methods. Flush irrigation was one of the most common methods. When water was at the higher level in the river than in the fields, cultivators only had to make a cut in the banks of the water channel and allow the water to flow into their field as required. Many times, however, the water level in the rivers was at a lower level, and therefore it was lifted through various traditional methods, as you could see here. Wells were the most popular modes of irrigation, and a lever called dhekuli or lalatha was used to raise the water in the pots. Water from deeper wells was drawn through cattle power. Now, the two very common methods of irrigation were ahar and the pine system. Now, this is a sketch of ahar and pine. Ahar was a natural reservoir having embankments across the line of drainage, with one side left open for drainage water to enter the catchment during the annual flooding. It is also used to conserve the rainwater. Now, the pine system was of two types. Smaller ones originated from ahar and carry the water to the cultivable fields. Larger ones originate in the rivers, from where the water is diverted to ahar through the temporarily erected embankments. Now, the British overlooked all these conventional, traditional designs. The revenue extraction being at the core, not only was the permanent settlement introduced, but efforts were made to even control the rivers to sustain it. Permanence of revenue became the main focus of the company administration, to the effect that the crops did not get destroyed due to annual inundation. It believed that controlling the flood was essential because enhancement of revenue from land could be possible only when agriculture was enduring. So the permanent settlement methods of revenue assessment was although similar in nature to the Mughal revenue system of earlier period, but the Mughal administration at the local level was strong, with officials like Kanun Go Chaudhary and Talukdars, and it also incorporated a degree of flexibility. The crop failures due to flood was taken account by the administration, as it also shared the loss of revenue following the lower gross produce. The land revenue under the Mughals was fixed as a share of the crop and so varied according to the crop cultivated, whereas the land revenue system, which was introduced by the British, known as the permanent settlement, was a tax on land. So the very basis of assessment was different. Under the British, the assessment was not on what crop the land actually raised, but on the basis of what and how much it ought to produce. So permanent settlement was a major departure, but the turning point came with the stronger embankments that the British introduced. The East India Company looked for permanence of revenue through construction of embankments. Till the late 18th century, the local communities built small embankments along their dwellings and not along the river channels. So this is a rough sketch uh, of the traditional embankments. The embankments had existed for long and might have been erected in order to prevent the spread of rivers into the cultivable land at different intervals of time and in detached pieces, and possibly by different individual cultivators to prevent their cropped land from inundation. The embankments were of different types and were built with different purposes. There were certain embankments in which a cut was made in rainy season for the sake of regulation of the inland drainage. These embankments were repaired for use again, and once the rain ceased, the repair work was taken up. The small bunds in the villages were useful for meeting the daily requirements of water in the villages and were connected with main river. They ran at the right angles from the outer inner bunds. If you can see, these were at the right angles. So they subdivided the space between the two and were intended, in case of any breach in the outer bund, to retain the water within the subdivision instead of allowing it to flow over the whole space. So traditionally, the people of the region also constructed large reservoirs for conserving water. And in one of the accounts of 1811, Francis Buchanan mentions about the small canals that were used to bring water from the river. These were maintained by the zamindars, and these small canals enabled the farmers to support the crop of rice till it gained maturity, and also to irrigate the winter crop of wheat and barley. So broadly speaking, two major assumptions can be posited. First, there was no obstruction to the overflowing rivers so that the river water inundated the cultivable field. And secondly, the drainage from the field was equally important so that the flood water recedes without obstruction and the heavier silt went back to the main river bed. A report of the Patna Commissioner in 1868 gives us an idea of the benefit of flooding, and he admitted that the inundation has done more good than harm, as the area submerged has been much fertilized and has now really a fair crop on it. So the commissioner, I quote, he says that it has always been my impression that inundation in these parts are in the end beneficial. They destroy the badai crops which are sown after the monsoon, perhaps, but they ensure a fair rabi crop, that is the winter ones. The height of the traditional bund were intentionally kept low in order to let the process of sediment deposition happen during the floods, allowing the deposition of very fine silt in the agricultural fields. During the flooding, the beneficial mud rich in organic matter got deposited in the fields, whereas the relatively heavier ones, which were harmful for the fields, remained seated in the main riverbed. The cultivators, thus, instead of taking measures to control flood, actually welcomed and capitalized on the flood by producing rice. Now, despite various observations by many commissioners, British commissioners of that time, and district level officers, the British government did not realize the significance of these conventional embankments, which had evolved over a long period of time from experience of flooding. Since the colonial government was more concerned with the collection of fixed and sustained revenue from the field, it felt that these conventional embankments have failed to answer the objectives effectively. So the official correspondence often reports on the damage done by the floodwater due to the failure of the embankments, the earlier existing embankments, which were smaller in height. It was believed that not being continuous along the river banks, they were ineffective. The officials were perturbed by the river's erratic and perpendicular designs, as you could see here. So the military board, in fact, recommended the construction of entirely new lines of bunds parallel to the principal rivers for them to be more effective. Now, contrary to this traditional practice, the colonial government perceived the long existing system of low traditional embankments wrongly, and instead of strengthening and improving it, mistook the shallow and wide cuts as abandoned navigational channels. The engineers of the Public Works Department termed them as dead rivers. Their, the reality was that the villagers deliberately used to make cuts in the embankments for irrigation. The government contemplated the idea of filling up all these earlier cuts, and it strengthened the embankments along the river as flood protection devices, which would safeguard the crops in future. The embankment along the southern bank of the Ganga protected the land on the southern side from inundation and allowed some land to be brought under cultivation. To facilitate this, the government also constructed canals, and one of the canals that was constructed at that time in 1869, and the work started in 1869, but it got completed in 1873, is the famous Son Canal. The idea of the Son Canal construction was first proposed in 1853 by Colonel Dickens, and to give further push to the irrigation of agricultural land, especially when they were protected now from inundation. Canal irrigation was planned to further enhance the revenue cultivation and to tax the irrigated land. Now, due to the revolt of 1857, there was a massive revolt against the British East India Company in 1857. This Son Canal scheme could not just immediately take off, and it was then in 1869 that the government hired the East India Company Irrigation and Canal Company to construct the Son Canal. So Anicut was actually constructed at Dehri on Son in Shahabad area of Bihar, and from here the water was taken through the canals to Patna and Gaya. Now the canal irrigation led to gradual disappearance of the traditional ahar and the pine system that we have seen earlier. The canal lines also obstructed the annual inundation of the flooding rivers, disallowing the traditional ahar and pine to fill up, and it also led to gradual loss of fertility of the soil. Now, as opposed to the rhetoric of the poor agriculture in dry regions of Bihar, one of the letters of the collectors of Gaya in 1869 suggests that there was no need for canal in Gaya and Shahabad area and in Patna. Now, one of the collectors, his name was T. Grant, he wrote that the Badoi rice crop was the main crop here, which was sown in early September, and the impact of Son Canal was felt within few years. So, if the Son Canal was constructed to irrigate all those dry regions, because now the rivers have been embanked, now the implication of the Son Canal was felt quite early. And in fact, there was a massive famine in 1896-97 in the region. So, the region, a wet region where you have a lot of rivers all around, how is it possible that a famine could come? And, the famine was not so common in that area. The Mughal accounts, the historical document do not suggest of any famine taking place earlier in history. So, for the first time, after the construction of the canal, famine has taken place. Now, another major work that was taken up by the British government in the 19th century was the railway lines along the Ganges, which also actually obstructed its flow and along the rivers. So you see this 1872 map, which shows that the river line is actually very much closer to the Ganges. It's very close to the Ganges. It's actually parallel to the Ganges. Now, there is a reason behind the British government following this line, although the shorter route would have been through a different area. If you want to connect Calcutta with Delhi, or for that matter with Allahabad, the shorter route would have been different. But they followed the older Ganges line because it is on the Ganges line that they were, they were having all those trading partners and trading routes, and that's why they made it a point that this railway line is also along the Ganges. Now, of course, these Ganges project was, the railway line project was successful, and you can see, this is a modern railway line which is going in between the floodplain of Bihar. So it's actually obstructing the full flow of the river. Now, one of the area which I intend to touch upon, other than uh, these cultivable area, largely cultivable area, is a Diara area. Now, Diara is basically essentially a vast landmass around the rivers, which is in lower Gangetic Basin. It is also known as the Char land. So here in Bihar, this Char land, this island formation, is known as Diara. Now, it is formed due to the silt deposition over a long period of time. The Ganga and its tributaries, especially in this section, form these Diaras, and it is actually a derivative of a Hindi term called Dweep, that is kind of a sort of what do we call Dweep? That is Diya, Diya, no, Diya, Deep.
Lamps.
It's a kind of a lamp. This lamp made of clay. So these, this was similar to those clay lamps that was made by the people. So they are basically, this term Diara has originated from that deep. So
You mean
you know clay formation of the
islands?
no, it's
Of the Char?
yeah, it's a clay formation, but then the term the Diara has or derived from that deep. Deep is a clay
But
lamp.
is it referring to the material, or is it
It is referring to the material,
Okay.
because it is here also you are actually, the clay is actually forming the land. There are silt which is getting deposited, the river changes its course and the land comes up. So that's a Diara. So during the early 19th century, the East India Company looked for inclusion of more and more potential cropping land under the revenue calculation. So Diara is one area which, from where the revenue was never calculated earlier, and it was never collected also. Now, the fluidity and temporariness of the Diara land, however, posed a challenge for the administration to achieve permanence of revenue collection. In the case of the suburban delta, historians have argued that permanent settlement was not considered suitable for highly fluvial East Bengal ecology, like Iftikhar Iqbal has worked on that aspect. And therefore, he believed that the Diara or the Char land, which he talks about, were deliberately kept out of the purview of the permanent settlement. In contrast to that reason, if you look at Bihar, we find that we witness a short-term lease system of Diara land, which was introduced by the British government. So we do not come across any mention of revenue generation from the Diara in the early modern accounts of Bihar, but the British bureaucracy, who relied on the local agents, could not acquire any inputs of knowledge early on in the late 18th century. Precisely due to this, that the Diara was not part of the proclamation of Bengal permanent settlement in 1793. Even the maps drawn just before the settlement by James Rennell in 1780, he does not mention about those Diara lands. But if you start looking, looking at the maps of 1800 and onwards, like 1796 and 97 map and this 1801 map, these Diara lands are being shown in the maps. Now that's an indication of the British government now considering even these vulnerable lands as an important land where revenue can be collected. So The maps drawn in 1801 began to include the Diara and Char, and from 1860s, the map categorically mentioned the newly formed lands each year. In other words, there was a gradual progression towards including such temporary lands into permanent settlement. The impact here was much more than the regular lands, as crops could be produced on the Ara land for only few months in a year. Now, there was attempt to settle this unstable Diara land, and that the colonial government was not bothered about the local condition is amply clear from the regulations of the permanent settlement. The landlord now had to pay the entire revenue demand, even if a particular area had not been able to produce anything. Now, one of the first changes that the British government introduces in terms of the Ara land is the Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation of 1825. Uh, because British government had started feeling that even the Diara land is kind of, I mean, if they are not collecting any revenue from that, it is a kind of a loss for them. So they thought that, if they regulate the entire Diara land, first of all, then it will be easier for them to collect revenue from those areas. So they introduced Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation of 1825. And one of the important provisions related to the changing course of the river and the newly emerging land was that when the land was gained by gradual accession from the river's recess, it shall be considered an increment to the tenure of the person to whose land or estate it is thus annexed. But at the same time, it also mentioned that this accession should not be understood to exempt the holder of it from payment to the East India Company. Evidently, the regulation contained the guidelines for determining the ownership of the land and land gained by alluvium and diluvium in order to resolve the disputes arising between individuals, and were passed to guide the courts in deciding the ownership of the Ara land.
I'm sorry.
So masquerading, yeah.
Can you explain the difference between alluvial and diluvial?
See, this alluvium diluvium is that land which is, because this is an area where you have frequent avulsions taking place. So sometimes when the river moves, there is a land which comes up. Then there are already existing land which goes inside the river.
That's diluvial.
That's diluvium. So then, I mean,
So
these.
how do you pay revenue on diluvial lands?
That's what
the
they
point.
wanted to regulate.
I see.
It is through these regulation that they wanted to bring permanent settlement in action here in the Diara land also, because earlier Diara lands were never, I mean, revenue was never calculated from there. It was never collected. There were, communities living there, but they were not supposed to give any revenue to the state. So we don't have any evidence of land revenue being collected by the Mughals and the Mughal officers from the Diara land. For the first time, after this regulation of 1825, that the British government start asking for revenue from the Diara land, from the zamindars. So the masquerading in the regulation was also the idea to bring even the fluid landscape under some kind of proprietorship. The right over a piece of land was not to be affected merely because it went under the water. The owner of the submerged land was deemed to be in constructive possession of the same during the period of its submergence and was thus allowed to claim back the same when it re-emerged out of the river. One of the major problems with the regulation was ascertaining the actual gain from the occupied land, as it was said that the Court of Justice, in deciding upon such claims and disputes, shall be guided by the best evidence they may be able to obtain by the established local usages. As a result, the government argued in the council that there was much litigation and the government could not assert its title to the possession of an island which was thrown up in the river, as it was surveyed a few years back and could not be surveyed till expiration of the next 10 years, because permanent settlements were often for 10 years. So there were problems with implementation of these regulations also. So the regulation of 1825 proved to be a defining moment for the ecology of mid-Ganga flood country. It initiated a cycle of transformation in which one act led to another, and the ultimate loser was the river-dependent society. The thrust of the regulation was in enhancing the revenue for the British. When the government felt that the zamindars were not paying rent on the pretext of frequent changes in the Diara land due to the inundation, it came up with special provisions with the Bengal Rent Act of 1859. Through this act, the government tried to ensure that the tenant was liable to enhancement of rent in case of increase of the area of his land by alluvial. So all these provisions, however, were in the form of guidelines and did not give the government the machinery and the power as such to collect a rent from the Diara land. So to do that, the Alluvial Land Possession Bill was passed in the council in 1868, and the bill was moved to, I mean, to improve on the existing practices for the revenue collecting zamindars. So the new portion of the Diara was taken possession of by the local revenue officers when the channel between such islands and the shore was not fordable. So now this created a kind of a controversy and resistance also. There were many zamindars who resisted with such kind of regulation. They believed that such regulations could be challenging. They believe that these regulations, if they are implemented, could be a problem for the zamindars themselves. But then the government was always intent on introducing these regulations for more and more revenue collection. Now, uh, let me now move on to another aspect. I just move on from Diara to the fishing communities who are living in the Diara. Now, traditionally, the peasants who are living in the Diara land, we have often been seeing that after the implementation of these regulations and the inclusion of these Diara land into the permanent settlement, uh, people migrated. They started migrating from those areas. Now, of course, we do not have any uh, calculation mechanism to calculate that how many people migrated, because we don't have such documents. Uh, but we have various reports which says, like one of the reports of Hunter, which suggests that the peasants were forced to look elsewhere for work and sustenance. Now, one of the communities which got affected by from the Diara land was the fishing community. Now, most of the fishing communities lived in these Diara vulnerable lands, and fisheries for the communities living in the Diara was the main livelihood. So the early modern regimes did not impose any tax on the fisheries, which was the economic basis of the Diara community. The right of the fishery was called the Jalkar. But after the British took over this Diara land as kind of a permanent settlement land, now even the fisheries was being included as part of the regulation, and they introduced a 1889 Bengal Private Protection Fisheries Act, which was an outcome of the increased governmental interference in the affairs of the traditional fishing rights. So, by the beginning of the 1890s, the judges in the criminal court were deciding on the infringement of the fishing rights in the Diara areas. Now, one of the implications of this interference in the Diara land is the migrating people. I mean, these Diara communities migrate to different areas. Now, this is one of the modern pictures of a Diara man working in the brick industry, which is all along the Ganges. So, if you move along the Ganges in Patna and Bhagalpur and Munger region, you will find all these brick industries flourishing. But then, these brick industries flourish. I mean, these are all bricks made of clay. After the inundation of the flood, I mean, the entire area which where the brick industries are lying, these get filled up with those silts, and these silts are later on used by the brick makers to make bricks. And these labors, most of the labor comes from these Diara land. So the
in the Diara,
it's not part of the Diara. It's on the other side of the Ganges. It's on the southern side. So the northern side of the Ganges is, I mean, is full of rivers. As I showed a map earlier on, when there are many rivers coming from the northern side, the Himalayas. So all these areas are full of rivers. So it's very difficult to carry on with these brick industries in the region. But it's on the southern side of the Ganges that you will find all these brick industries flourishing. Now, in conclusion, mid-Ganga basin, the term Diara is often used as a metaphor for the economic hardship of the people living along the Ganges and the very natural process through which Diara land is created. Cutting and deposition of soil also leads to instability and uncertainty in the life of the people here. It is because of this frequent process of creation and dissolution of the Diara land that no permanent land tenure system could develop historically. But my paper here has shown how the political and economic changes taking shape in the 19th century affected the Diara commons. Diara land could never be organized well for all practical purposes, and it remained as a fluvial landscape in dispute. The British administration for the economic control of the region came up with various acts and rules, but these could not stabilize the situation in the Diaras. There was ecological ruptures due to embankments on the southern side of the Ganga, leading to the shift of the river course northwards, inundating the huge tracts of land on that side, and it impacted the flood-dependent societies inhabiting the Diara land. So the Embankment Act, the Canal Act, the Tenancy Act were brought with the intent to enhance the revenue, but all such acts of government led to ecological rupture of mid-Ganga region. Thank you.
Thank you.